This week on In Post, I'm processing a shot from a recent trip to La Jolla. Hey everyone, welcome back to This Week in Post. I'm Scott Davenport. Thanks very much for joining me. And today we're going to process a shot from a recent visit to La Jolla. If you watched the In the Field episode, you'll see some of the behind the scenes that went into selecting this location and deciding on the composition. And today we're going to take this into the studio, do some post-processing on it, and come up with a final image. So let's get over to the computer and let's get going. So here in Aperture, I have the photo that came more or less out of the camera here, and I've processed it twice. So this is actually the same image, just processed in two different ways. And let me bring up the inspector here so we can see what's going on. So first, info, here's the file name, and you notice as I move between the two images, this is the same file. I just have two different versions. Here's this version and version 2. And so for the base image, really what was closer to what came out of the camera, I've processed this primarily for the foreground. A little chromatic aberration adjustment to deal with some of the high contrast areas in the dark areas over here on the left side, and play with the exposure, mainly adjusting the black point to open up these shadows a little bit. On this image on the right, same image, same file, but I've processed it differently for the sky. And the primary thing there is the exposure, bringing that exposure down to pull back in all that detail that was in the sky. And so these are the two images I'm going to take into the Perfect Photo Suite to do some work on, blend these together to get a nice base exposure, and then do the stylization. So with both images selected, I'm going to grab Edit with Plugin and choose this option about opening as layers so that both of these images will be opened as a single document with each image as its own layer. So I'll click that and we'll head on over. So here in the Perfect Photo Suite, I've done a bunch of stuff to this image, and so I'm going to just walk you through what I did. This was really a fair amount of experimentation. I mean, I knew I wanted to blend these two images, so at the very bottom layer, here's the image that was reprocessed to expose for the sky and bring that sky in. So this was the second image that we saw in Aperture where the exposure was lowered. And this next layer here is the image that was exposed or processed to expose for the foreground. And so what I did there was just use a masking bug, so grabbing the bug, dropping it onto the layer for the foreground, and masking away, hiding the sky. So this black area here in the mask is hiding the sky of this layer. You can see in the thumbnail how blown out it is, and we're showing what's on this layer. So with those two pieces done, I simply took that and did here, layer, I can't do that because I don't have it highlighted. There we go. But I did a layer, new stamped layer, and that created what I named the blended layer. So this layer here is the combination of these two. I can turn these off. Everything's in this single layer. The next thing is I spent a lot of time retouching, so using the Perfect Eraser and the Clone Stamp tool to tidy up all these little bits and pieces that were distracting. This small piece of seaweed here, and particularly paying attention to these reflective pools, all these little bubbles of foam and dots. I brush those away because I want this surface of water to be very, very smooth. And once that was all done, you can see on the retouched layer, a lot of things disappear. These things go away. I kept that bit of seaweed, but a lot of the bubbles and foam go away. So if I were to zoom in here, let's just maybe 50%, and just kind of look at this pool here before the retouching. So I see all this stuff in here, all this, let me use the hand tool, you can see a little better. All this stuff in here, all these things over here, brushed away. Not too difficult. I will say when I got to areas on the rock, that's where I'd use the clone tool. When you've got things that have texture, the clone tool is a better choice. When you've got things that are kind of soft to begin with, the eraser does a really good job, and the retouch brush is pretty good there too. So the next thing I did here was actually use some color fill layers. The sky was warmer, as I remember it, and I wanted to bring in some of those oranges and some yellows. I started with a color fill layer. Now I'm highlighting the layer, I'll turn it on in a moment, but you can notice that the opacity of this layer is very, very low, and I played with the blending mode. So adding a color layer, you just click on this guy, you get a whole bunch of choices. You can choose your color, whatever you like. You get all your different pull downs and all your different colors that you want. And you can also select the blending mode. Let me get rid of that layer. So for this one, I chose an orange, and I'll turn that on. And only wanted a touch of it. Didn't want it to be overpowering, but enough, particularly in these clouds up in here, and the rocks to become a little warmer. And the overlay blending mode worked nicely for that. Just really mousing over, scrolling up and down. And as I move the mouse up and down, my eyes are on the preview and looking at, well, what's the effect to the image? And I liked how overlay looked. I wanted a little more yellow, because as the sun was just dipping middle of this cloud, there was a bit more yellow showing up in this area of the sky when I was on scene. So I added a second colorful layer, mainly base of yellow, and you can see there's a kind of elaborate mask here. So let me turn on the masking view mode. I'll use red so you can see what's going on here. I wanted to keep the yellow primarily in this area of the sky, so you can see that there's a pretty good gradient mask here, and that's evident in the masking area here. Dropped a bug onto the scene here, so I can mask the yellow away from the lower half of the scene here, but not at full strength, right? This is with a very strong feather. But then the extra touch was to grab the masking brush and brush the yellow back into these reflecting pools. Particularly focusing on this one, making sure I got a lot here, because I've got yellow up here. I need to have that reflected down here, maintaining that balance between the sky and the reflected sky. And then did a slight amount of brushing to remove some of the yellow tinting from this. If I switch the masking view to grayscale, you can really get an idea of some pretty heavy recovery of the yellow here. This is the masking bug, this gradient. This is brushing to bring back in the yellow in the tide pools. And then a little just, almost like a dodge or a burn here to remove some of the yellow from that part of the sky. Now, once I was done with that, this is the the combination of the retouched layer and these color fill layers. You also, I should point out too, you can see the same thing with the color fill layer. I play with the opacity, I fiddled around with the blending mode just to see what things would come out as. So with the combination of all these, I did another stamped layer, and that's what we see here. And let me do a new stamped layer so you can kind of see what that would look like. So here's my new stamped layer. Wait for it to crunch away here. All right, and so this, you can see I can turn off all of these things. This is the combination of everything from here to here. And this is the layer, as we see here, that I took into Perfect Effects to do the final stylization on. So let me bring that up into Perfect Effects. I'll use the actual layer I used. You'll notice I converted it to a smart layer. I'm doing like this, so that we can have the changes remembered and re-editable. So I'm going to double click on Effects. We'll pop over into Effects, and I'll show you the filter stack that brought us to the final image. In Effects, I began with the tone enhancer. I start here a lot, and this was just to correct the overall tone. And just the single filter really did a lot for the image already. I'm just using the auto setting. So by applying the filter by default, just auto set all these things. And I pop the clarity up just a little bit, so these edges around the tide pools and where this rock is meeting the ocean, edges between things, got a little crisper. Now at this point, when I was stylizing this, I wasn't quite getting everything that I wanted. I wanted a little more color in the sky, and so I opened up the browser here, and I started to look through various things, and just looking at the different previews. And when I saw this vintage sun one, that really caught my eye. And actually, it's in my favorites, as you saw there a second ago. So let me pop open the quick view here. You can see a bigger version of it. I really like that. I was like, wow, that looks really cool. I like that, quite a bit. and it's a completely different feel. It is beyond what the reality of the scene was, but I still found it pleasing, and that's, I guess, one of the beauties of not being a photojournalist. I get to play with things like that. So what I did from here is I didn't want to lose my tone adjustment. So on the preset, if I right-click, I get this little menu that says I can use the preset, which will replace any filters I've added, or I can insert the preset. And by inserting the preset, it will take all of the filters that are part of the preset and add them to the stack. I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. I'll undo it in a moment. But you can see what it added is it added a color enhancer, a split tone, and a vignette. I didn't like the vignette, I removed that, and I fiddled around with these other ones. So let me undo what I did there. And so these two layers, the color enhancer and the split tone, these came from this Vintage Sun preset. Get rid of that browser there. And the color enhancer I did nothing with, maybe a slight nudge on the saturation. I honestly don't remember if that came from the preset or not. The split tone I did play with more. So the split tone starts with mainly these quite contrasting colors, a brighter yellow and this quite reddish orange for the shadows. And the amounts were from the preset. I played with the balance in changing how much shadow did I want versus how much of the highlights do I want. So moving to the right, you can see things get more yellow, and moving to the left, things get a lot more red. So I'll undo those. I settled it at about 49, right in the middle, and I did add a very, very slight gradient to just take the edge off of the red tones in this rock here. So I positioned the bug really, really low, and then drag that feather line up almost to the horizon line, just to make a nice gentle fade. And that was it for the split tone. Next is dynamic contrast. Now this one's kind of interesting if you're looking at the mask here. We turn on the dynamic contrast. And I'm just using the natural setting to start with, and played slightly with the medium and large sliders. Actually, no, I take that back. I didn't touch the sliders. I touched the layer opacity. That's why the preset reads custom. It's not because of the slider change, it's because of the opacity change. Well, what's interesting here is a lot of times we use contrast to bring out things that have texture, like in this case, these rocks. And when I look at this photo, to me, it's really not so much about the rocks, it's really about this sky and these really cool clouds. And so you can see with the mask, and I'll turn that on with Control M, I've removed dynamic contrast from the rocks and from the ocean, and only have it showing up on the reflections of the clouds and the clouds themselves. And so if I do a before and after, you're going to see the clouds and those reflective pools really jump out after the dynamic contrast is applied, but the rocks remaining soft. And this is where I want your eyes, on this cool sky and these nifty old tide pools reflecting that. And last but not least is a vignette, a subtle one, very gentle, just on the corners. If I reduce the feather all the way, you can see that it's a very, very large vignette. I'll pop that all the way back up. So just give it a little edge to draw the eyes in toward the center. And that is the whole thing. Here's before, and here's after. A completely different look and feel for the image. And just having some fun, perusing these presets, and then just experimenting with some of the sliders. So there we go. Some relatively basic adjustments, and this was much more about creating a feeling, less so about creating an I was here shot documenting the scene. Since I'm not a photojournalist, I don't feel bound to keep things within not the realm of possibility. That's important to have your shot be believable so our brains don't reject it. But artistic license, being able to add color, change the tone of the scene overall to evoke a certain emotion or a certain feeling. That concludes this week's In Post episode. Hope you picked up a tip or two that you can use the next time you're processing an image. And in the meantime, please send me your questions. You can contact me through my website, leave comments here on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, there from time to time, Google+. You can find me in a lot of places. Easiest thing to do, go to my website and it has all of my social media links. Thanks very much, and I will see you again soon.